Before I go any further, let me acknowledge either the Darinja people who are on the land of Jervis Bay in New South Wales, where I am, or possibly the Gadigal people who occupy the land, whose land it is if you're sitting in or around Sydney, or the Larrakia people of the Northern Territory. On your behalf, I acknowledge their stewardship of this land in the past and the future, and with whom we share a responsibility into the future. And if that acknowledgement has a particular pertinence in a forum concerned with war, with violence as a central piece of policy, because if anything is built into the DNA of the Indigenous people of Australia, unfortunately, it is the experience of violence. In the next hour and a half, we're going to listen to three significant speakers about the prospect of war, or the fascination with war, or the preparation for war, and using the Northern Territory as the grounds for that. There will be plenty of opportunity when the speakers have finished to ask questions. You need to put your questions in the chat column, and via help with my good friend Dennis Doherty, I'll field those questions and put them to the respective speakers. That's enough from me. Welcome to this significant forum. It's timely that it's happening, and I'm grateful in particular to Hannah Middleton and Dennis Doherty for, as usual, having the characteristic vision to set this forum up. The first speaker is going to be Justin Tutty from the Northern Territory. Justin is a significant activist, a member of the Independent and Peaceful Australia Network, usually known as IPAN. I want to give Justin a particular comment by way of introduction in terms of his recent protest on Darwin beaches, or a Northern Territory beach, against the usual use of such sites as a rehearsal for war games, or as for the practice of war games. It's not easy to have the guts to be a protester consistently as a life experience, but it looks to me as though Justin has done just that. Welcome to this forum, Justin Tutty.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Stuart. And if someone can make me a presenter, I'd like to share my screen soon. Yeah, I'm in Darwin. I'm on Larrakia land here, where I've been involved with various peace groups, including Base Watch and Top End Peace Alliance, and I am a founding member of IPAN, which is the national umbrella group. And if you're in a local peace group that somehow isn't booked into IPAN, check them out. Yeah, unfortunately, Chips, who was going to join us, has had to. Am I going sharing? Chips can't join us. So I just wanted to share this one story of Chips, which was recently circulated. I think ABC did an article reminding us that in the 80s, a bunch of people in Darwin painted this protest. He calls it it's not a mural, it's a roofle, with the Aboriginal flag and no B-52s on it. So we have had B-52s visiting from time to time. I've been swooped by one on the main road. And, in the past, there have been protests against the B-52s coming. So they are already part of the scene around here, but the recent news about Tindal is significant, that they're going to be, a number of them are going to be permanently based at Tindal, which is on the National Highway, just south of Katherine. So a lot of my campaign experience is nukes. I come up for Jabiluka in the late 90s. I've done stuff with the Environment Centre on uranium mining and nuclear waste, and all of that's gone really well. Like, we beat back the nuke dump. I know they're having another go at South Australia. And there's a push in the noughties, but now there's no uranium mining in NT, just a few wicked rehab problems. So like a bunch of us, I'm activated by the nuclear-capable B-52s and various other nuclear implications of the build-up of USA forces and the preparations for another war, which could well become a nuclear war. But as a Darwin local, I have a responsibility to focus on local social impacts. We've had 11 rotations of Marines here now. The first one was just 250, but now there's a full task force of 2,500 each year. We've had some USA Air Force co-located at the RAAF base right in the middle of Darwin, walking distance from my house. And that construction at Tindal's been busy for a few years now. And in various messages on AUKUS, we've been told to expect a USA Army base, a USA Navy base, and possibly a second lot of Marines. So there's a bunch of them here and there's a lot more to come. And Darwin's still a small town. It's like 140,000 if you include the satellite city and the surrounding rural living areas. So just the population bump alone is a significant impact. We do have a prior local history of sexual assault by visiting service personnel. This century, before the Marines started coming, we used to get a USA Navy visit every couple of years, R&R from the biannual war games. Just in the time I've lived in Darwin, like from the late 90s through to when the Marines were announced, there were 3 assault incidents I knew of just through my social circles. One particular incident was the gang rape of 2 local teenagers, one of whom I know to be a member of an old Darwin family, a family prominent in the public service, successful in private business, well connected across politics. So you can imagine that was a widely known incident, which the family pursued doggedly, though ultimately unsuccessfully. If you're interested in that, later on I'll put a link in the chat to a sensitive telling of the story. But 2 points for tonight. Pursued doggedly. From this particular incident, we've identified flaws in the outdated status of forces agreement, and so improvements that could be made to better manage the risk, which we've consistently advocated for, to zero effect. And the second point, well connected. This incident and the risk driving it was well known to many people in Darwin, including local leaders, specifically both the federal Liberal MP and the Labor NT Chief Minister, who were in place at the time of the first Marines deployment. And yet, in 2012, just a few weeks before the Marines first arrived, that same NT Labor Chief Minister, who was personally involved in the family's quest for justice, declared that concerns about the history of sexual assault by Marines on bases in our region were insensitive, offensive, scaremongering. And he evoked the imminent 70th anniversary of the bombing of Darwin, suggesting it was inappropriate to talk about these risks in the context of that anniversary. His comments were in response to a question posed by Senator Scott Ludlam to Lieutenant General David Hurley, who of course later went on to become a very amenable Governor General, but who in 2012 was at Senate estimates in full uniform, where he totally lost his cool and responded with loud, angry indignation to these very real concerns. For those who didn't already see the risk, government commissioned social impact assessment just before the first tranche of Marines arrived in 2012, which identified 2 risks which they rated high: the increased risk of sexual assault and the risk of unrealistic expectations of economic benefit among the small business community. The next year, government found a different consultant who ran a computer model reporting that we should be more worried about locals raping Marines. On the 3rd year, yet another consultant ran a process focused on attitudes rather than risk. So instead of presenting or measuring data, they asked us how we felt. And when it came to the topic of sexual assault, they confidently informed us that government had already told them there hadn't been all that much, which we knew to be false, because like I said, Darwin's a small town. Some incidents get publicly reported and others get passed through personal networks. And others are covered up. On that, I draw your attention to the investigative research of journalist Henry Zwartz from ABC in Sydney in 2018, issued a bunch of Freedom of Information requests and reported how ADFIS, the investigative services arm of the Australian Defence Force, were intercepting assault complaints. That story ran in Sydney, but not in Darwin. And in fact, a couple of years later, local ABC presenters declared that there had not been any incidences. By 2021, Henry had moved to SBS and done more reporting, uncovering more incidents. And when I catch my breath, I'll put links to those reports in the chat. And of course, these intercepted assaults are additional to those which are publicly reported. And I want to mention a couple. The first year the Marines were here was uneventful. Diplomatic mission, quite correctly. A couple of hundred of their most friendly, polite, young and innocents. Ambassadorial, what you call a charm offensive. But they mostly kept away from town. When they were here, they're on their best behaviour, playing sport, volunteering for community groups. Not much went wrong. But the next year we did have an incident. There were still not many Marines, just a few hundred. One weekend, a USA Navy ship docked for R&R during the Talisman Sabre war preparations. When news got out that an assault had been reported to police, my mate, who was doing sexual assault advocacy at the time, got a gruff call from the Marines with 4 words: "It was a sailor." What happened next was shocking. National media reported that the USA Staff Justice Advocate in Canberra made a formal request under that treaty, the Status of Forces Agreement, requested that the case should be heard in the USA. Almost as shocking, or maybe more, I can't decide. The then Senator George Brandis declined. When we got in touch with the Staff Justice Advocate and asked why on earth they thought a rape during R&R shouldn't be tried in Australia, they assured us there was nothing special about it. They were just following procedure. They intended to request carriage of any similar case going forward. The trial dragged on. I think he had to come back to Darwin a couple of times over the next year and a half. And silly me, I thought it was open and shut because he'd actually sent her multiple messages the next day, acknowledging what he did, saying it was wrong and apologising. Okay, I'm a wide-eyed babe in the woods. He got off. No conviction, no penalty, no justice. Just a couple of months ago, September, I was contacted by an American woman whose friend was subsequently assaulted by the same sailor back home. She just wanted to let people know. After he got away with it here, he went on to harm others. And that really stung for me because it was a theme I'd already heard. In 2016, the Marine Colonel was pre-deployed as liaison for the rotational force, was dismissed and sent home only 10 days in the role after drunkenly propositioning an Australian colleague, sharing nude photos of a colleague's wife and various other similar creepy and grossly unprofessional behaviour. But instead of facing USA consequences for his Australian misconduct, he was promoted sideways. 6 months later, he was charged with raping a fellow officer's 6-year-old daughter. He was convicted of that the following year, but eventually had it overturned on military appeal and was allowed to retire with benefits. That child rape would never have happened if his prior misbehaviour hadn't been swept under the rug. He got away with it here and went on to harm others. Since then, there have been a few other incidents go to court, including one this year, but like I said, I give attention to social impact as a matter of local responsibility. And as I do so, I'm made even more concerned about other broader implications of the growing foreign military presence. I find the hands-off approach to this eminently manageable risk is a worrying measure of how well our far-sighted and responsible leaders might address the large matrix of harm and risk and impact posed by the build-up. Because along other concerns such as illegal weapons, nuclear weapons, cluster munitions, depleted uranium, social impact looks like something that could be well met. You can't tune the presence of illegal cluster munitions. They're either here or they're not. We don't know either way, but it's conceivable they're part of their plans. But social impact is different. It's at most, it's a distraction or an annoyance to the military planners. We've identified and lobbied for specific reform proposals. It's one risk that could be managed and mitigated without impacting any plans for USA forces in Australia. So if Australian leaders and officials refuse to acknowledge a responsibility on social impact, if they refuse to speak up for Australians on this eminently manageable concern, how do we imagine they're confronting more challenging questions like nuclear weapons? When you think of those same representatives, the ones who won't risk offending the Americans by reviewing the outdated treaty under which their jurisdictional status is defined, would they dare weigh the Treaty of Rarotonga against the neither confirm nor deny policy? Would those same brave souls demand assurances that B-52 crews at Tindal would not carry or handle or store nuclear warheads? Would their courage extend to similar questions about USA nuke subs visiting Aussie ports? When the USA generals elevate interoperability, do we think our bold leaders identify any boundaries? Would they note that there's some operations we don't want Aussies to cooperate with? I can't see it. That's why I think this meeting's important. That's why the work of groups like Sydney Anti-AUKUS Coalition and IPAN is so important. The role played by peace groups around the country to bring attention to these big questions that we know the great leaders are shirking, and to propose limits on the rapidly mutating alliance relationship is essential. So I guess my message for tonight is let's not let them get away with things here that could go on to harm others. Thanks, everyone. I'm really pleased to be here.
Justin, thank you very much for that detailed analysis. I'm particularly grateful to you for identifying the dangers of the hands-off approach, the sort of go lightly attitude, apparently, of politicians and other senior officials. But also, I'm grateful to you for identifying the long-term consequences of the social impact of making the Northern Territory into an even larger American military base than it has been before. Now I'm returning to really the Alice Springs and to Kieran Finnane, who, among numerous impressive achievements, I noticed is the founder of the Alice Springs News, which is well over 25 years old now. Among other things, Kieran is the author of books, in particular one called Trouble, about life in and around Alice Springs, but more importantly, the book called Peace Crimes, if that's not a contradiction, which is an examination of the establishment and the consequences of Pine Gap. So, Kieran, thank you for being here. Thank you for what you've done in that community of yours over the past 30 years or more. Welcome to this forum.
Thank you very much, Stuart. And I must just stress that I'm a co-founder of the Alice Springs News, which certainly would not exist without its founding editor, Erwin Klander. So as you pointed out, my experience of the Northern Territory is in and around Mbantua Alice Springs, which is in Aranda country. So, 1,500 kilometres south from Darwin, and the militarisation that's going on up there. So like most people, I rely largely on the work of journalists and other information networks for gleaning my understanding of what's going on elsewhere. And that forms the basis of my reflections tonight. I'm going to talk about the media's trivialising treatment of the military expansion in the NT. I'll make some suggestions from a former working journalist's perspective about what could possibly be done to influence that for the better. And I'm going to make some observations about activism in the NT, and again from a journalist's perspective, where the focus and the energy seem to be and what opportunities this might present for the peace movement to augment the work that they do. So on the media, my case study is the ABC 7 p.m. news bulletin out of Darwin, which I watch most evenings. Most of its stories are generated by NT reporters, but they also take their pick of the ABC's national and international stories. A week ago, in a 2-minute report, National Defence correspondent Andrew Green told us that there would be an increased rotational presence of US forces in Australia. I'm sure you're all aware of that. But I was looking at how the report was put together. So the US Defence Secretary, he didn't have to stress the significance of that announcement. Green and his producers did it for him. They ran the introduction to the story under dramatic music, with footage of military aircraft, ships and soldiers in action, referring to the world's only superpower. They didn't need to specify the US, and to it boasting 1.3 million active military personnel. That was the only number that was cited in this report about the increased presence in Darwin. They didn't mention Darwin or Tindal, that's where the soldiers would be coming to, or the Northern Territory. And almost in passing, Green told us that the gap in submarine capability for Australia would be overcome by Australian soldiers being introduced to the American fleet, i.e. US nuclear-powered submarines, another expression he didn't use, and they will be in constant visits to our shores. So I was reminded once again of the seductive power of military stories, especially for television journalists, their producers, and apparently their editors. I was reminded too of how easily the local is erased in these reports from the national stage. Would that be the case, I wonder, if the rotations were coming to Sydney? But Darwin doesn't object, not a murmur, as far as you can tell from the ABC. Year round, they feed NT viewers a steady diet of military stories. I estimate at least one a fortnight out of the Darwin newsroom. They stay well away from serious questions. The focus is on what men and women in uniform are doing. Basically, the fun they're having with the latest things that go very fast or blow other things up. Invariably, the news anchor introduces these stories with a smile. They use only military sources, never balancing what is basically military propaganda with an independent source or a critical voice. And certainly, they never make a connection with what is the bottom line of military activity, death and destruction. It has become especially weird this year when there have been devastating news reports out of Ukraine running in the same bulletins as these puff pieces, as if there is no connection between the preparations for war and what happens when it gets real. The puffery reached a climax during this year's multinational war exercise, Operation Pitch Black. News anchors were allowed to refer to the aspiring top guns out there, meaning children, as this was a story about defence visiting schools. They ran a story in the news bulletin made for national breakfast television, a very different category of television, as you well know. This was a story presented by Tony Armstrong, handsome, charismatic. It went for 5 minutes, an almost unheard of length in a news bulletin, set to pacey music, and it showed Armstrong playing Top Gun, slow-mo effects, out there in his G-suit, I think it's called, going for a fly in an ultra-fast, barrel-rolling electronic attack aircraft. It had no news point whatsoever. Defence PR could not have been happier. Now, I don't suspect the newsroom, which does many good investigative stories and on-the-ground reporting in the NT, of much more than somnolence on these issues. That's certainly not confined to the Territory, but it is dangerous. I had high hopes that Four Corners would take a more probing approach. And of course, they did break the news of the B-52s permanently deployed at Tindal. But it seemed to me that they too were captured by the dark allure of military wargaming, losing about half of their airtime to that. And ultimately, the program didn't ask much more of the audience than to feel frightened. In amongst all this, in the Northern Territory, was one tiny bright spot: the efforts of Darwin reporter Jacqueline Breen, with a feature story exploring attitudes of local residents to the military build-up. What was encouraging about it was that she focused on the military build-up. You just virtually never see a story focused on that. And she was wanting to explore attitudes, and not surprisingly, given the paucity of information and analysis that they are exposed to, they ranged from the basically complacent, that's just the way it is, to the opportunistic, there's a lot of money to be made. There was no top-end critical voice. Breen came to me for the sole critical view from 1,500 kilometres away. You know, Justin might have some perspective on why that would be so. She also did a serious follow-up report to the Four Corners program, again trying to develop an NT perspective on the issues and to get NT political leaders to speak to them. And again, you never hear our NT politicians speaking on military issues, other than on anniversaries of the bombing of Darwin and, you know, generally extolling the virtues of the military. So what can be done to generate more coverage of the territory's militarisation and to encourage a more questioning approach? Excuse me a moment. Journalists are hungry for information. They're constantly looking for fresh ideas, story ideas, even as they deal with an avalanche of media releases every day. Adding another media release on what is likely to be seen as reflecting a minority viewpoint is probably not going to get activists very far. A more fruitful approach, I think, would be to identify journalists like Breen, independent thinkers who want to do some serious reporting, and send them in judicious quantity, don't swamp them, reports and articles of interest. Suggest credible people who could speak on the issues. Know that reporters and their editors are generally going to respond better to experts and insiders as sources than they are to activists, except perhaps when the activists are doing an action. And know too that releases strong on rhetoric but sparse on news points are not going to get very far. This takes me to the other point I want to make tonight. The peace movement, and with all respect for the people who dedicate themselves to it here in the Territory, but on the ground in the Territory, has very little momentum. That's my observation. Activist focus here is in two main fields: anti-racism and Aboriginal social justice as one, and the environment, particularly the climate crisis and related issues, and particularly fracking, as the other. Environmental activists are especially well organised here at the moment. They're conducting and/or sourcing good research related to local developments and thus generating frequent news stories with credible spokespeople, including locals, available for comment. And they're building strong relationships with traditional owners that give their campaigns significant moral authority and newsworthiness. Despite the great personal commitment of a few individuals, I don't see this kind of work happening within the peace movement, or it's not reaching out through the media. They're just not having that impact. But the more important point is the opportunity that exists, I believe, to connect the concerns of the peace movement with the concerns of environment and climate activists, and to tap into their well-organised energy and focus. Military expansion sucks up huge resources, including budgetary. It has immediate local environmental impacts like air and ground and noise pollution. It lays waste to large stretches of country and undoubtedly generates huge carbon emissions. You never really hear any challenging questions asked about any of that. So IPAN recently circulated a useful media release from Scientists for Global Responsibility. That's the kind of activist organisation that does carry clout in newsrooms. They had issued a report focused on the carbon footprint of the world's militaries. Not surprisingly, there are big data gaps, but their informed estimate was able to demonstrate that the scale of military emissions is the 4th largest carbon footprint in the world, greater than that of Russia. It's not hard to see the journalistic questions applied to the local situation that a report like this could or should stimulate. Passing it on to journalists like Breen with a brief personal note and perhaps some suggestions about who to contact for expert commentary is an obvious step for peace activists to take. Passing it on to activists in leadership positions, people like the impressive Dr. Kirsty Howie, who heads up the Environment Centre in the NT. That might be even more fruitful. And it seems that the broader population would respond to that connection being made. In the report on a recent qualitative survey of Australian attitudes towards the alliance with the US, I was interested to read that hardly any Australians think of the alliance in terms of the threat scenarios being bandied about by policymakers. And that while the majority see the alliance as a net positive for Australia, they think it needs to encompass deeper cooperation beyond the traditional defence context, particularly to address climate security. I love the simple formulation from Jane Addams that peace is the nurture of life. As we become daily more aware that our human lives are inseparable from the planet, it seems to me that the fundamental goals of the peace movement and the environmental movement are deeply intertwined. And it would be strategic, I think, for peace activists to take this connection up. Thank you.
Kieran, that was a very valuable and for me very impressive analysis. I'm struck, I mean, and people I can see are trying to applaud you. They're muted, so you can't hear the applause. Look, I'm particularly grateful for the point you make about the seductive power of military stories, the equally informative point you make about the fear of Northern Territory politicians to ever speak much about the military, and then that warning that you finished up with about the carbon footprint left by the world's military and the dangers of that. I've just come from taking part in a discussion with representatives from Costa Rica about the way you can achieve security without an army. And one of the points that came through very clearly was that nobody in their right mind should start to talk about peace unless they also are talking about dealing with climate change. The two are inseparable. So thank you for that, which is really a good cue and an introduction to Richard Tanter. Richard's got a formidable record. I mean, I could take about 20 minutes to introduce him, but the role of the chair, the role of the chair is to be precise. Richard is the Senior Research Associate at the Nautilus Institute. He's the Honorary Professor of Political and Social Studies at the University of Melbourne. He's had a long career looking at peace, security, environmentalism, the threats of nuclearisation in southern and eastern Asia. We could say a lot more, but it would be much more important now to hear from Richard about the dangers faced by the military perspectives and the military resources being poured into the northern part of this country. Richard.
Stuart, thanks very much. Dennis, can I share my screen now?
Dennis, you're muted.
Yes, you should have it now, Richard.
All right, thank you. All right, yep, here we go.
Is it working? No?
Yep, just a minute. Oh, you should be able to do that.
Yep. Share screen?
Yep. Okay, let me see what happens when I put this on. It's not behaving, just a minute.
Is it a video or a?
No, it's just a PowerPoint with visuals.
You know, there's two little
Yeah, hang on.
two little dots down the left-hand corner.
Yeah. And the right-hand corner on my screen? No.
I thought it was left anyway.
Sharing screens. Here we go. It's asking me to go to my system preferences, which I don't really want to do. I want to just share the screen with you. Okay, look, I think we're going to have to.
You can send it to me and I can put it up for you if you like.
Okay, all right, I'll do that quickly.
Have you got my email?
I think yeah, just hang on a tick. Dennis, can you give me your email address? I'm sorry. Apologies for everyone. I don't know why.
It's Dennis Doherty, all one word.
Yep.
At Dennis Doherty.
One S in Dennis.
One N, yeah, in Dennis, and the Doherty is the DOHERTY version of Doherty.
At Dennis Doherty.
Yeah. .org. Yeah,
Okay. If this works, fine. If it doesn't, I will just ad lib, of course. Okay, there you go.
Okay. It'll take a few minutes, so.
Look, it's giving me a hard time about that, so I'm going to just talk. Okay, I think that's fine. Okay, thanks very much for that. I'm talking to you from Wurundjeri country, which is here in Naarm in Melbourne. And it's really actually very hard to come after two speakers like Justin and Kieran, not only giving us the perspectives from the central focus of this arc of militarisation across the north of Australia, but particularly those two lucid and powerful expositions of the dimensions of this militarisation. And I'm particularly grateful to both, for Justin for in particular talking about the social impacts in Darwin. Like Justin, I worked with Henry Zwartz on that work several years ago. And when I opened my newspaper or looked at my screen for the report of the OSMIN 2022 meetings in Washington, and saw the scale of the expansion of the Marine Air Ground Task Force in Darwin, my heart sank. I'm very familiar from many years in Japan of the effects, social and cultural effects, of stationing large numbers, particularly of Marines, in Okinawa. And I thought that the way that Justin framed this, that this is something which, for all the other dangers that the militarisation of Australia presents, this is a relatively manageable one. And both the folly and the cowardice of our authorities in Darwin and the ADF and the Defence Department that Zwartz pinpointed and Darwin and Justin reiterated are extraordinarily important for the peace movement to campaign about, on the basis, as Kieran emphasised, of measured, well-documented, reliable reporting, and then presenting it to journalists is really important. And Kieran's extraordinary exposition of that very simple case study of what comes out of ABC local news. You mentioned Andrew Green, Kieran, and I've learnt to look on his, when I see his face with, I know we've got more pablum coming, or just stale porridge instead of reporting. This is really very, very serious. I have a very minor version of it. I have no end of journalists ringing me up to say, can you talk to us about Pine Gap? And I do. I'll talk to almost everyone except the National Party. And I probably should be more broad-minded there. But regularly they say, this is a deeply mysterious base. We know nothing about it. Well, a guy called Des Ball worked on it for 40 years before I became involved with him on this issue. And I just want to say, to give you an example, we know now, as a result of Des's earlier work and the 8 really large forensic, technical and historical studies Des and our colleague Bill Robinson and I did, we know more about Pine Gap than any other intelligence base in the world, certainly any American foreign base. And absolute nonsense to say we don't know about it. And just to make the point that we had a superb exposition of it in clear and lucid language in Kieran's extraordinary book, Peace Crimes, which was extraordinarily ignored by large parts of the mass media, and certainly I'll say nothing about academia there. This is a real problem. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about the B-52s briefly, the submarine folly very briefly, what I've facetiously and stupidly labelled Osmond Delights, because I'm just so shocked by what's happening. And Hannah has asked me particularly to address the expansion of Pine Gap, all in 10 more minutes. Actually, I haven't started my clock, so I'll just start. The key background for all this is an extraordinary elevation of the tempo of Australian integration into US war planning. This is not new, but it has happened to an extraordinary degree in the last 20 years, and especially in the last 10. And I think the Osmin announcements, which must have sent a shudder through Justin about the plans for Darwin and Catherine, epitomise this. What's most important to understand is that involves a concomitant loss of Australian strategic autonomy. The more you are integrated, the more your technologies are integrated, the more the doctrines, the careers, the equipment are integrated, the further away from the prospect of Australia's independent Australian foreign and defence policy we go. We're all talking about militarisation, that arc of militarisation, which is now so spectacularly developing from Northwest Cape with its submarine communications facility with nuclear submarines as well as non-nuclear ones, with in particular the new and less well-known Australian contribution to preparations for American space warfare through the Space Surveillance Telescope, the most advanced military telescope that's ever been built, and a space surveillance radar. We signed off for those, thanks to the Rudd government and also to the Gillard government, without much thought of the risks that brings, added risk that brings to Australia. There's a kind of chaos of defence planning when you peek underneath the curtain and have a look at what's actually happening there, which is driven by domestic politics, venal domestic politics. Well, I was going to say in the case of Scott Morrison, but he specialised in that. And this extraordinary, very difficult to explain desire to cling ever closer to the United States. And I'll just say there was a very extraordinary indication of the importance of this in the latest quarterly essay in a letter by Malcolm Turnbull. The previous essay had been by Hugh White, and Turnbull was very upset about it for all sorts of reasons. But for about 5 pages in that letter, Turnbull viscerally eviscerates the Morrison decision to adopt nuclear-powered submarines from wherever they may be, principally, on the question of they're driven by domestic politics, but in particular, and this is coming from Malcolm Turnbull, ex-Prime Minister, etc., in particular, because of the diminution, indeed the loss of strategic autonomy that will come if we rely on United States, or even, heaven help us, Britain, the soon-to-be disuniting kingdom, for nuclear technology. Indeed, one member of the United States Congress the other day said, well, he would be in favour of lending us nuclear-powered submarines. We'd own them 50%, and the Australians could have 49%. There couldn't have been a clearer statement of our preparedness to sign away strategic autonomy. The B-52s, I'll say something very quickly about that because they've been mentioned. That's happened in two stages. First, remember that Morrison committed over $1 billion to the expansion of Tindal a year and a half ago. And then we learned, courtesy of Four Corners, the one good thing about that program, apart from Kieran being in it, that the United States Air Force is tendering for further expansion of RAAF Tindal to accommodate up to 6 B-52H. This is an aircraft which is, B-52s have been around for 70 years. So it's important to know these are the surviving ultra-modernised B-52H strategic bombers coming out from Barksdale, Louisiana, or Guam usually. The aim is a very simple one, to lessen the vulnerability, particularly apropos Guam, to that strategic bomber force to Chinese long-range missile attack. So you spread your resources around. Lucky Australia. Australia's role is going to be, apart from supplying the real estate, is going to be supplying RAAF tankers and early warning control aircraft, maybe F-35s if they ever fly properly. But the tankers and the early warning control aircraft are absolutely essential to get those strategic bombers somewhere near China. Tankers, obviously, air warning control. If you don't have it, you're simply dead in this age. I have some disagreement with viewing these B-52Hs that are going to be deployed immediately as nuclear capable. I think they'll be the non-nuclear ones to begin with. I think we can observe that, and I think one task for the peace movement is going to be looking out for the visual evidence of any violation of that. But of course, there is an important problem stemming from the loophole in the South Pacific Nuclear Weapon-Free Zone, which forbids the presence of nuclear weapons in Australia, except for transits and visits, which of course are undefined. Of course, it's extraordinarily important the Albanese government be pressed very hard to say we will not accept any visits under any circumstances now. So a task for the peace movement there, both in terms of movement-based research and monitoring, but also escalating that issue. I won't say more about the other parts of AUSMIN for the moment, but happy to talk about it there. The submarines, they are a gross and dangerous folly. If they work, if the plan works as advertised, which is exceedingly unlikely, their only utility is to contribute marginally, just a little bit, to the protection of US air and naval assets attacking China in the air, in the sea, and especially in coastal defences. Or, much more seriously, helping, at least in a pretty minimal way, to destroy China's key nuclear deterrent capability, which is not on land, but it's in their submarine-based missile force. It's very small, it's very vulnerable. The Chinese will not forget, even if the submarines do not go ahead, they will not forget that we have put up our hand to contribute to an existential nuclear threat. We wouldn't forget it the other way around. This is unbelievably foolish, massively expensive. The opportunity costs for the rest of the Defence Force, we might have our arguments about what they spend their money on, but some parts of it are actually desirable and rational. I think it's actually very unlikely to eventuate, certainly in the form it's been advertised. And this idea that we are so in fear of China that we have to surrender what's left of our strategic autonomy to get nuclear-powered submarines for attack on China is just delusional and very, very serious there. Hannah asked me to say something about the expansion of Pine Gap, which is something I worked on a fair bit. And I'll upload in the chat a link to the talk so that you can see the PowerPoints and, more importantly, the other resources that I've linked to. Pine Gap dates back to 1967-68. We did a series of major studies in the 2010s through the 2017 period. Des Ball is dead, but Bill Robinson and I are about to publish a 7-year update of everything that's happened since we last worked on it. And it's an enormous expansion. But let me briefly remind people of what Pine Gap is about. In cartoon forms, this is a huge American intelligence base in Central Australia, probably the most important outside the United States, which has 3 quite distinct systems. If you like, the 2 summary phrases are in cartoon form are Pine Gap's big ears and its big infrared eyes. And these 3 systems are not complicated to understand, but probably important to just get it separated in our mind. The original and most important system is the ground station for satellites about 36,000 kilometres over the Earth, which just sit in one spot, essentially, geosynchronous, geostationary satellites. This is space-based signals intelligence collection by those satellites of a huge range of electronic signals downlinked to Pine Gap, processed, sent to the United States. So space-based signals intelligence. The second is that same thing, but reversed. Antennas at Pine Gap pointing up at other countries in that same geosynchronous orbit, listening to their communication satellites, sucking up everything that they beam down to the Earth. Chinese communication satellites, Chinese military satellites, Indian satellites, Indonesian satellites, Russian satellites, they all got to talk to the Earth sometime. So Pine Gap is, if you like, catching it from above and catching it from below. And the third, quite different, going back to the days of Naranga in South Australia, but at Pine Gap since the year 2000, is as a relay ground station for another set of American huge satellites sitting in the same orbit, roughly from the middle of the Pacific through the edge of Africa, looking for the heat bloom, the infrared heat bloom of the launch of missiles of any kind. And of course, this historically has given the US president the famous 15 minutes of warning of a nuclear attack on the United States. I want to talk about the expansion of Pine Gap rather than spending any more time about it, but they keep those 3 systems in mind. Pine Gap is growing. It's becoming even more important than it has been at any other time for the past 50 years, and it's always been important, through planning for a possible war with China. I'm not suggesting that the Americans are planning to start a war, but all militaries rehearse their possibilities. And this is in addition to the huge number of roles that Pine Gap's accumulated over half a century. So Pine Gap today is critical for all aspects of US military planning and operations, non-nuclear, of the kind they operated in Afghanistan and Iraq and so on, but of course also nuclear. And the very concerning thing is those 2 functions are very closely tied together now. We'll come back to that maybe if you want to in questions. The dimensions of expansion, well, first of all, the numbers of antennas. You've all probably looked at Google Earth and seen pictures of Pine Gap. You see parabolic antennas, you know, that dish-shaped ones you sometimes have on your own houses, except these are 25, 30 meters in diameter. Many of them are inside radomes, the plastic radomes. They're there to keep the dust and snow out, but also to stop people like us working out what they're pointing at. The numbers of antennas have expanded dramatically at Pine Gap over the years. And now, maybe back in the 1980s, there were about 12, year 2000, there were about 25. There are now about 45. And the last 7 years has seen the most rapid expansion of those antennas. Now, the antennas are kind of like mushrooms. They're not the important part of the system, but they're the bit you can see most easily. So they give you a bit of evidence about that. The second thing about the expansion, the numbers about Pine Gap, is the numbers and types of satellites that are linked to Pine Gap. And both on the infrared early warning side, which is very important for other things as well, like missile defense, and in the signals intelligence side, the numbers of satellites linking to Pine Gap and their capabilities are expanding enormously, are also expanding, as well as the antennas. The systems, think about your own IT system. I've bungled the sharing here, but all of you are probably much more skilled than I am in that. Think of your own phones, for heaven's sake. We didn't have any of what we're using today 20 years ago. Now, that's only a very minor version of the way that Pine Gap is controlled. We did a calculation of the size of the floor area of the operations buildings at Pine Gap. There are 2 of them now. And we had some idea of how they're configured. I did a calculation which showed that the floor area of the operations building of Pine Gap, where there are men and women in and out of uniform, American and Australian, driving computers and screens, it would cover the playing area of the Melbourne cricket ground. This is really very, very big. The last point is that there is no doubt that the China-focused concern of what are called the tasking schedules, the meetings every month in Washington, every week, and then again at Pine Gap every day. What will the satellites point to? What will the antennas listen to? What are we going to focus on? Now, with the prospect of war with China being very real, accidental, intentional, one side or the other, we don't know, but we should be fearful. These are central concerns of Pine Gap's. The signals intelligence, tracking everything of what is called the electronic order of battle of China, which means where are its units? What are they emitting? How does America know where they are? Every kind of military unit, every kind of military command, every radar. These are concerns of Pine Gap to find, to work out what they are, and to work out how the priorities of neutralizing them. These things are happening now. The last, I'll just say something briefly about, is the nuclear role of Pine Gap. This is really, really important. And I'll just take one example, which is the early warning satellites, the relay ground stations. Currently, there are 4 large antennas. Another 3 have just been built and will become active with an entirely new set of infrared satellites starting next year. And then with another generation coming after that over the horizon to deal with hypersonics. These are important for missile defense, missile warning, early warning. You might say, well, that's defensive. Make up your own mind about that. They're also important for missile defense. That's the American and the Japanese and South Korean shield if the North Koreans launch a nuclear weapon at the United States. Again, you might say that's defensive. Except that in the peculiar logic of nuclear war, if only one side has a missile defense shield and the other does not, then it becomes highly threatening. And as far as the Chinese are concerned, they are immensely vulnerable because their own deterrence force, this horrible nuclear balance of terror, which is grossly imbalanced in the American-Chinese sense anyway, but they will have no capability to defend themselves. So a defensive activity becomes highly offensive. And then lastly, particularly important for us to know about, is that when those American satellites detect the heat bloom of the launch of Chinese silos in Xinjiang or wherever it may be, they'll also calculate that the silos next door have not launched. And then they become the targets for an American second strike. That's not possible without Pine Gap. So we are directly implicated in nuclear targeting. I'm going to finish there, I think, and just say I'll circulate some more information about that. The implications, the depth of this militarization is extremely important. Stuart mentioned this extraordinary pathological fear of China. There's not much that's nice about the current regime in China, and I have great concerns, especially about its domestic policies. But it is not the advancing imperialist drums of war enemy that we saw portrayed in that Four Corners program, whatever else it is. And a key role for the peace movement now is to start thinking about the extraordinarily difficult task of how do we, in civil society in Australia, start to talk with China rather than just at China. I'll finish there. Thanks. Thanks very much, Stuart.
Richard, that was, in a way, that made me anxious because I'm not sure how easily I can digest the key range of information which you gave us. And I think the general public would be indebted to know more and more, to have you repeat what you've just described as the consequences and the capabilities and even the size of Pine Gap. The analogy to the Melbourne cricket ground sticks in my mind, but so too does your concern about the loss of Australia's strategic autonomy, your concern about this stupid desire to cling ever closer to the United States, because the two sides of the coin are, on the one hand, the generated fear about China, and then the other is the absurd fascination with alliance with the United States. And thank you too for the reference to the gross and dangerous folly of the submarine program. It's the excitement about buying a nuclear-powered submarine in 25 years' time. It seems to be crazy when the major threat to human existence is coming from climate change, the consequences of climate change anyway. Now, I had advertised earlier that I would take questions from the chat column, but most of the comments in the chat column at the moment are in terms of congratulations to the three speakers. I've only got one or two questions, and I just want to say that many of the questions can easily come from the speakers to one another, as well as from if anybody wants to test questioning by switching off their mute and posing a succinct, precise question, that would be great. The first question I've got, in a way, is to the last speaker, to Richard, which concerns how would Pine Gap have to change if it was to take seriously our support for the Test Ban Treaty?
That's a really good question, and I've written about this, and I'll give a link in chat in a minute, courtesy of Kieran, who Alice Springs News published this some time ago. Firstly, obviously, we have to, this is beyond Pine Gap, we have to abandon the policy of relying on protection by nuclear protection by the United States. In other words, getting rid of the nuclear umbrella. That's not a Pine Gap concern, but it's pretty basic. Secondly, in the case of Pine Gap, the most important thing we can do, which we'll have to do if we are to sign in good faith, is close down the most egregious nuclear connection at Pine Gap, which is that relay ground station, the so-called early warning station at Pine Gap, which is a direct connection to US nuclear war planning. And what's more important to understand, two things about it. Firstly, as a relay ground station, it happens entirely automatically. It's not Australian personnel at Pine Gap. It's not American personnel at Pine Gap. It's happening in the United States, directly contributing to Strategic Command. And that means, of course, that Australia has no actual means of saying, no, we don't like this particular version of it. So the second thing to understand is that it's actually technically redundant. The United States has other ways of getting that information from those satellites back to Strategic Command by so-called satellite to satellite crosslinks, and by linking to combat commands around the world. It already does that. So Pine Gap is not, that part of Pine Gap is dangerous and is not needed for genuine US national security. And that argument takes a little bit of working through, but it's one that I'm now absolutely convinced is actually technically viable and the task is to make it politically acceptable. That wouldn't change anything about the rest of Pine Gap, and there's a great deal to be concerned about that. But if we're looking for a pathway that a Labor government with a bit of backbone could campaign around, that's the way to do it. Close the most egregious violation of the treaty's prohibition on assistance to nuclear war planning.
Okay, Richard, thanks. Now there's a question, the next question from Ellen Christie is to each of the speakers. What will the Australian public possibly get out of the AUKUS agreement? So that's a question to all three of you. Perhaps, well, I don't care who we start with, but I need more than a pregnant silence.
Well,
Richard, do you want to have a go again?
Yeah, I'll have a go. Bugger all, to use the technical phrase. It will be career building for parts of the ADF. It is career building already for the ADF in many respects, and certainly for the Defence Department, and certainly for intelligence agencies. We see some of our current intelligence chiefs have spent a great deal of time working in the United States. So that's one thing. It will mostly have negative effects otherwise, but Defence Department officials I've talked to who are now very unhappy stressed to me the importance of what they sometimes call the shiny new toys factor. And this is really, really important. You would think it shouldn't be. And well, look, the costs are going to be very great. I'm sorry that doesn't quite help. I think that it is very useful to both the Liberal Party or the Coalition, the Peter Duttons of the world, and it's also useful to the Richard Marles of the world, who do not have much of an idea of defence policy other than what comes down the email from Washington, as far as I can see. And so that's beneficial to them. It's very beneficial.
Do Justin or Kieran, do you want to comment on that, respond to that question about what the public will get out of the AUKUS agreement?
I will just say something, which is that I think when it gets more real, if it ever gets more real, and a big East Coast city has to face the prospect of a nuclear-powered submarine in their locale, the Australian public might become a little more unsettled. I think at the moment, with such a focus on the militarisation going on in the top end, all of these things are kind of relegated to be happening up there, but they're not necessarily going to port in the top end. And especially not unless another deep water harbour is built, as I understand it. And so if they port in the East Coast, I think a lot of Australians might get a little bit more anxious about it.
Okay, Kieran, thank you. Look, a related question to this one about AUKUS has come from our good comrades in the Green Left, Peter Boyle and Pip Hinman, who are asking about the consequences or the benefits of Japan being asked to join AUKUS. Can you pick that one up as well, Richard?
Look, I think what's happening is that we've seen some remarkable success by the United States in restructuring its global alliance system. On the one hand, NATO now is effectively a global arrangement with Australia, South Korea and Japan. Now, I think we're called enhanced strategic partner or some nonsense, but our Prime Minister, their Prime Minister go to NATO meetings. So NATO is now reaching into the Indo-Pacific, as the Americans call it. The other thing is the Americans have been very smart, and instead of the rather ancient, creaky hub and spokes relationship between United States and Japan, United States and South Korea, United States and Australia, they have encouraged all of those countries to build relationships, all their second tier allies to build connections with each other, bilateral connections. So we have an agreement with Japan, as the questioner just pointed to, which obliges us to help in certain respects. We have an agreement with the French to help, and we have also an agreement with India. All three of these, for example, involve certain degrees of access to our naval and air and army bases. Most importantly, involves logistics. We're learning from the Ukraine war just how important that is. And so in the event of a Japanese conflict, presumably with China, over those rocks in the East China Sea, the Senkaku or Diaoyutai Islands, as the Chinese call them, they're just rocks, basically. We may be obliged to support Japan in all sorts of ways there. Similarly, if the French have a conflict in its colony in New Caledonia, as they have had armed conflict in the past, we may be obliged to support the French there. So that's a very successful way in which a new approach has been taken, and it adds to the danger. I lived in Japan for 13 years. I think it's a terrible country full of very sweet people. I have a very firm view that it could be threatened by China and must not be threatened by China. But the danger is we'll be drawn into a war about what are, quite frankly, Japan's colonial possessions, these rocks in the East China Sea. And that's the folly that's involved here.
I've got a question from Hannah Middleton, who characteristically is taking us back to the very, very direct human consequences of a possible war. Hannah is asking if politicians would publish the extent or make estimates of the extent of civilian and military casualties in the event of a war with China, would that affect the consciousness of the public and make them think more critically about this assumption that there will be, and we might even benefit from, a war with China? A question about the need to estimate the dangers of huge military and civilian casualties.
Well, I think Kieran just touched on one part of that, so maybe I'll let her go first.
Over to you,
Thanks,
Kieran.
Richard. I think Australia doesn't have much stomach at all for losing its own people to war. When we've had people serving overseas, and any of them have died in a range of circumstances, including accidents, you know, each time it's been reported and treated as a national tragedy, when that essentially is the nature of war. I think that if we started to have some more realistic talk about what military engagement involves, I do think it would be very helpful.
And a more realistic awareness from the what's been referred to as the peace movement, Kieran, because you've raised a few questions in your address about the somewhat minimalist role of the peace movement, although those weren't the words you used.
I mean, I think the peace movement could apply real pressure on governments to make those disclosures, but obviously I think it needs to be officially acknowledged what the cost of war would be in terms of human losses in particular, and not only our own, but also the other side, the so-called adversary, what their losses would be. I think we do need an emphasis on those costs.
Yes. There's a very specific, I'm sorry.
Can I say something briefly there? Because I absolutely agree. I think that this is something absolutely critical. The simple fact is that the idea that Australia will rely on the United States for protection in the face of nuclear threats using nuclear weapons commits the Australian government to collusion in what can only be described as genocide, intention to call for genocidal scale casualties of the most appalling variety. This is simply unarguable. The fantasy that nuclear weapons can be used on some deserted island and just blow up some technology that will be enough for nuclear deterrence. The aim is, in fact, nuclear warfighting. And the aim is, in fact, to use nuclear weapons for the only purpose for which they are rationally usable, which is to kill very large numbers of people. We managed to avoid the implications of our war in Afghanistan over 20 years. 70 plus Australians died, 250 plus of them were very seriously wounded. But I never, ever, apart from occasionally from painters like Ben Quilty, never hear of the tremendous scale of devastation caused by that war in Asia's poorest country. And it was absolutely extraordinary. And now, of course, we're colluding with the Americans in punishing them for winning the war. So I think it's really important that the actual consequences be front and center. It doesn't have to be, if you like, war porn, which these things often can become, but it does have to be honest and direct.
There's a very specific question from Nick Dean to you, Richard. Could you comment on the forced posture agreement of 2014?
No. I think actually this is an area where Nick knows better than I. I've been away on other matters. Maybe Nick also means the more recent forced posture review and the US-Australia forced posture review, which is pretty awful. And what Stephen Smith, our former foreign minister, and Angus Houston, former chief of the Defence Force, have got planned for us to meet the requirements for Mr. Miles. I think the thing that I'll just say is that the AUSMIN announcements, which were really quite comprehensive, I mean, AUKUS is nonsense, basically, but the AUSMIN announcements every year tell us a new level of acquiescence or perhaps volunteering by the Australian government here. I'm not across all of these details at the moment, and I should be. And I suppose I'll just make a general point, if I might quickly, Stuart. Nick is a good example, as are all of the people involved in that IPAN inquiry, including yourself, I think, in terms of not just the submissions, but the extraordinary report that was produced, edited by Jonathan Pilbrow and his colleagues. It's extraordinarily hard to edit that kind of work and make a coherent presentation. And that's a major piece of work. And we need to mine the work that was done there in terms of ideas for what should strategic autonomy for Australia mean? What should a rational defence policy mean? What are the real threats, starting obviously with climate change? So I commend that report and want to thank everyone involved in it.
Okay, another quick question to Justin, to Kieran and to Richard. Can you say something more specific about the environmental costs of not of the prospect of war, but of the preoccupation with militarization as the only means of security?
Yeah, well, certainly, I think.
Justin, go for it. You go for it.
I previously shared that photo of the destruction around Tindal. It's quite a massive area that is being cleared and scraped and smothered in concrete. But in addition to that, we have the training facilities, which our American friends are enjoying so much. They wax lyrical about the huge expanses they have to shoot and drop and do things to, which they don't have anywhere else. An incomparable, vast expanse of land that they're free to do what they will with. Of course, in general, I'm sure war is pretty bad for the environment, and US military is a bigger climate polluter than many nations. But yeah, certainly it is a big direct impact, and I would like for us to be more effective in engaging the environment movement in confronting that.
Kieran, do you want to comment on that?
I might just add a little bit to the picture that we've got of it in terms of geography, because we've had our focus on the north in this discussion. But when I was writing my book about Pine Gap and I was doing, my usual annual trips south to see family, I became acutely aware of the swathe of military development that has basically taken over the central axis of Australia. So starting, and it presents a very coherent picture, really. So with the big weapons manufacturers in the north of Adelaide, there's huge capital investment there by the Commonwealth and by all of those, you know, Northrop Grumman and Lockheed and so on, BAE Systems. And then you drive north into the desert, and there is the massive active weapons testing range in South Australia, 100,000 square kilometres of land. Where they blow things up and you know, use the skies, of course, for their, you know, drone testing and so on. And, you know, sweep up through the north. There's Pine Gap, a huge expansion there, as Richard has explained. There's the Over the Horizon network at Jindalee and its further network through remote Australia, and then up north. So it's not just that northern arc, but that central axis as well. And I was thinking about, you know, why this country, and obviously sparsely populated, but also politically and economically the weaker states. The Northern Territory goes without saying, it's completely dependent on the Commonwealth, essentially. But South Australia too, a very lackluster economy that then really welcomed that injection of capital and advanced manufacturing know-how that came with, you know, this vast development of military industry, the weapons manufacturing. So I think it sort of starts to fill in a picture in the Australian continent of, you know, great significance. And we want to think about our country being sacrificed to that end.
I'm going to jump in here and not go straight to Richard now, because there's a question from Robert Stainsby asking us to think a great deal more about the mental health of veterans. If we wanted, in other words, the implication of that question seems to be that if we wanted to talk about the consequences of war, we might only start with looking at the terrible consequences for people who have fought in wars, and there is of course a Royal Commission going on at the moment into the suicide of veterans. Can we, if we are to raise the consciousness of the general public about the taken for granted assumptions about war, could we do better than remind ourselves about the mental health of veterans?
Well, I'll just say something briefly there. I just think that's an extraordinarily important comment. And, you know, as an Australian of a certain age, I think back to my childhood and friendships through life, and noting that an extraordinary number of the fathers of friends of mine were unbelievably damaged by the war that they went through in the Second World War and Korea, to say nothing of earlier wars. And I think I think that we quite simply, if we ask people to go abroad and kill other people in our defence, firstly, that's the first incitement to mental illness in itself. But when we put them in these situations, as we have, I'll take the case of Special Forces, the Special Services Regiment and the Commando Regiments, which we have sent time and time again to Afghanistan, leaving aside the morality of that war, or immorality of it. We have a very particular duty to care for their mental health in every respect. I'd also add we have to have the same responsibility to the victims in Afghanistan. But I think that we know enough about the Vietnam War as the most recent example to know how deeply damaging that was across the social fabric through what happened to the veterans there. And clearly, as a conscientious objector, I didn't like that war, but we have a responsibility. And the more you have a double standard by denying certain things, the more it weakens the general impact of the movement, I think. If that doesn't make too...
No, that makes it. Thank you for that. Look, another key question. I mean, the momentum behind the questions is, as usual, increasing as we come to the end of the forum. But this is an important question, certainly from my point of view, from Lena Kolelat, if I pronounce your name correctly. It's about the role of universities. Two of them at least signing. Had more than happy to sign agreements with the Department of Defense to consider the wisdom of building nuclear submarines. Is the implication of the question from Leila is, what is the role of universities? Are they independent places of thought, or are they merely the handmaidens of corporate enterprise? Can anybody rush to the defense of universities?
Go, Justin.
Well, just to save Richard from having to answer all the questions, I'll just know that the big military corporations, the weapons manufacturers, are involved in supporting some university programs. And I think that is so deeply concerning, as is, you know, any commercialization really of our universities. You know, they should be funded from the public purse to keep them independent and rigorously focused on research and not having to answer to the corporate requirements of these big investors.
The extraordinary example is my own university, Melbourne University. I should say I'm only an honorary there, which means an unpaid casual occasionally, or a paid casual, I should say. But the most disgraceful example of that is that Melbourne University accepted funding from Lockheed Martin, the biggest arms manufacturer in the world, the biggest nuclear weapons supplier in many respects, to set up for a set of scholarships and for a research centre in high-tech various kinds. Melbourne University, I think when there was part of a group of people led by MAPW who attacked the university about it, the council refused to disclose any of its minutes of discussion about it or the content of the agreement. I think the university had the idea that somehow it was special, that, wow, look, the biggest company in the world, bit stuffed around the edges, but doing lots of non-armaments things as well. They wanted to come to us. I did a research project which found 150 examples of that by Lockheed Martin around the world. And that was just a bit of web surfing. In other words, we're locked in. And the idea, I think, of a military industrial academic complex, to use a variation on President Eisenhower's phrase, is absolutely right. I think it's very real. And I see versions of it in what I could politely call underwhelming involvement in discussion on defence and strategic and foreign policy matters. I was present in, I can't say where I was, but I had somebody very close to a senior person in the university talking about the B-52s and how important it was, and really how important it was the location of RAAF Tindal in Darwin. In other words, Turkey didn't even know it was 300 kilometres away, so let alone anything much more important about it. Look, we are in universities, as Kieran said, have deep problems, basically stemming from neoliberalism and decisions made in the 1980s, I fear, by Labor governments initially, and then seized upon by Conservatives. And we should not be surprised with in many respects, a collapse of academic integrity in many aspects of our universities at the moment.
Yeah, can I risk a personal comment to back up what Richard said? I mean, I was director of a flourishing Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies at Sydney University for 20 years. I mean, 5 years after I left, it was closed down. I mean, largely because we'd caused so much problems by being activists in West Papua, in this terrible civil war in Sri Lanka, and regarding in particular the fact that people like myself went several times to Gaza and the West Bank. And so the idea that the university could cause controversy was really what was in the veins of the powerful opposition to the centre and its eventual closure. Look, that's enough for me. I'm sorry, I can't take any more questions. I'm going to allow us to go over time. We're already over time. I don't think that matters for 1 minute because this has been most significant. I'm going to indulge myself once more by asking a question about the other threats to life on planet Earth, from pandemics, from the violence of climate change, as well as from the threats of nuclear war. What I can't comprehend is in the discussions that we're having tonight, or in the opposition to anybody who's involved in war or into policies of militarism, why the issue of the violence associated with climate change should not be a massive priority that makes the preparation for war look irrelevant. Why can't we have in our consciousness the concern with pandemics, with threats from climate change, instead of all the massive paraphernalia completely unknown to, I would guess, more than 90% of the population, of the kind of detail that Richard described with regarding the functions of Pine Gap.
If I might just say that that survey report, the qualitative survey of attitudes towards the US alliance, does indicate that I think that Australians would be receptive to precisely that argument, and that all the noise is being made by the politicians and they're getting a lot of media attention, but I think the Australian people would respond to a priority being placed on, let's confront the most critical challenges. But of course, you know, climate, we can't neglect the focus on particularly nuclear weapons because of its existential threat alongside climate change. But yeah, this should gain a lot more traction in the public debate.
Sure. I mean, let me try and simplify it in terms of what people understand by their security, whether it's the people of China or the people of Germany or the people of Somalia or anywhere else. I mean, how in heaven's name is their security affected by the massive buildup of arms? If your place is burnt down and your homes are washed away, as happens on a regular basis in many parts of the world, what is the possible relevance of Richard Marles and co rubbing their hands at a greater alliance with the United States?
Well, I want to just say something following from what Kieran said and answering you there, Stuart. I think that at the heart is this question of why don't people understand a simple notion of human security, of the security of the human. And there are any number of things getting in the way of that, not least the PR machines that Kieran basically was talking about with the media, not least our constitutional fear of China going back, for heaven's sake, at the time of Federation, the state of Victoria, the state of South Australia and the state of New South Wales had military forces in China to put down the Boxer Rebellion, for God's sake. We still have, and the deep racism that permeates all of our defence thinking. I think we know bits of this, but we need to start disaggregating it. On the question of climate, clearly climate and pandemics are a much more serious threat than war in itself. We learned from Ukraine that war does happen. Don't be stupid about that. That's very serious. But I guess the way of thinking about it for me is, and for me, the urgency of both climate change and nuclear weapons is It's likely, because we are doing so badly globally on mitigation of the climate threat, we know what's going to be set for the next 30 years at least, is that we are going to be facing in the next 20, 30 years, a new form of global conflict about the visceral fears when climate change really begins to impact in the rich countries, and then they decide to have their part in it. And then the blame that's going to inevitably come, both for historical reasons and for various failures of all sorts of schemes. And if we still have nuclear weapons at that point, where we have this new form of conflict defined by climate change, it's going to be an unbelievably dangerous world, which is why absolutely now is the time when I think that's partly why I threw in my hat with ICANN. That's the right answer now on climate change as it is on other matters.
Well, look, all three of you have more than thrown your hats in on this really urgent key issue. And I think, I mean, there are 2 points I would finish up with by way of summary. The first is the one that Richard just mentioned. A priority concern should be about the security of the human. That means everywhere, not just the Australians.
Yes.
I mean, the notion of protecting our borders is a nonsense. So that's one major issue, the security of the human. And the second issue, in a way, relates to Kieran and all the other journalists and writers and commentators. How is that concern to define and redefine the security of the human going to be communicated to the general public, so that it becomes a part of their understanding instead of lining up with the notion that our security will be guaranteed by an American alliance, which is the idea that is peddled largely by the mainstream media and is easily digested by the sort of climate deniers whom I have coffee with every morning. Although I shouldn't have admitted that. Look, I didn't want to end on a light-hearted note on such a serious issue, but that business about that goal of the security of the human, of every human, you know, that reminds me of the Urujuru Nunakal poem about all one race. You know, I'm not interested in coloured jibes. I'm not interested in coloured tribes. I'm for humanity, all one race. And I think that would be a fitting ending to this important forum. Thank you, all of you, for taking part. I apologise for not being able to field more questions than appeared on the chat column, in particular the last 10 minutes. And I thank again Hannah Middleton and Dennis Doherty for having the vision to set up this important forum this evening. Happy Christmas and a non-violent New Year.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stuart. Good to see you, Richard.
Lovely to see you, Justin and Kieran. And I want to see both of you sometime soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks very much.
Likewise.
Bye-bye, Hannah.
Good night. And thanks, Dennis and Hannah.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys.
Thank
See
you.
you guys.
Bye.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Okay, Dennis, well, you're free to leave. Thank you for staging this.
Oh, that's all right. That's all right. I just want to make sure I get down all the chat before.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So don't feel you have to stay, and
Okay.
although you're welcome to stay.
No. I'll talk to you both soon. Well, let the dust settle. We'll talk about it tomorrow.
Okay.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Okay. And thank you, thank you very much. Thanks, everyone. Okay, see everyone.